Let's talk about newspapers. And I know that the first question I really have to answer for my audience today is whether or not newspapers are still relevant, because my students tell me all the time that papers are going the way of the dinosaur and that no one reads newspapers anymore. And I have to tell you that's just not true. Newspapers are still extremely important in today's media landscape. Yes, readership is down. Yes, we are opting more often to read online journalism as opposed to print journalism, but those online news sites have to have reporters and trained journalists who are writing content for them, or they should have trained journalists who are writing content for them. The reason that newspapers are still so powerful is because they have such great credibility and they have been around for a very long time. They are an institution and they're not going away anytime soon. Just the environment's changing and the financial situation's changing, and the way that we consume our news is changing a lot too. The earliest newspapers were collectively known as the penny press, and I'll talk you through a little bit about the history, and then we'll get into where we stand with newspapers today. The penny press was really important, and you can read more about this in your textbook, but they really had the power to define what news was. They also set up a model for paper distribution that's still in effect today. They found an economic support system for papers, which was to sell advertisements that helped keep the newspapers afloat, and of course that model still is in play today. So the penny press was actually the front runner to the modern newspaper we have today. Let's talk a little bit about what makes a paper, and what makes it special. There are some really truly defining features to newspapers. For one, they have extremely diverse content. This might come as a surprise to some of you, but if you think about your local hometown newspaper, or even the AJC or the New York Times, we do see a diversity in content. We see everything from what's going on politically, we see new socioeconomic news, we see lifestyle stories, we see sports, we see even more entertainment-based news as well. So there's definitely some diversity in content there. Newspapers are also designed to be convenient. Newspapers are best when they are easily accessible, and that's the case not only for online newspapers but for print newspapers as well. In fact, if you are a student who attends classes physically here at Kennesaw State University, when you walk into the building where I reside, the Social Sciences building, regardless of what entrance you come in, if you're coming in one of the main entrances, you can pick up a copy of the New York Times on your way in, and that's the point of news. We want people to have access to it. Most of the time news is local, and we tend to forget this too, because our local papers are overshadowed by the prominence of bigger papers. But the great thing about newspapers is that they can report on what's happening in local communities way better than national newspapers or anybody else really can. I grew up in a very small town in North Alabama, and our local paper was really the heart of the community in a lot of ways, and it's where everyone got their news. So definitely that local angle is what helps keep them afloat today. They also serve as a very important historical record. I'm a historian part-time. I do a lot of communication history, and I actually do a lot of newspaper history. And it's really interesting to go back and look through old newspapers, because they do tell you a lot about the times in which people live. Kind of scary to think about what's going to happen with historians in the digital age, but for now we'll keep going back to newspapers. They also serve as a watchdog. That means that newspapers are specifically designed to keep a check on elected officials in our government and keep us informed about what's happening. It keeps everybody accountable. They're also very timely. We know newspapers work on deadlines, and those of you in the class who are interested in being journalists definitely will have to adhere to your deadlines like no other. Very, very important. So we see everything from random headlines like from Wetumpka, Alabama, naked men arrested for vandalizing a gas station, to news about fights, to news about what's going on politically too. So that's really what makes a paper. Now it's important also to remember that the government in our country really isn't allowed to intervene in the everyday affairs of newspapers. In fact, let's talk a little bit about the First Amendment, which will be a recurring theme throughout class. You really should memorize what the First Amendment is all about. It says that Congress can make no law that infiltrates in any way or hampers in any way freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to peacefully assemble, and essentially freedom to complain about the government. Why the First Amendment is so important to our democracy is because in order for a democracy to work, one of the prereqs is a free press. That means that our press needs the ability and the freedom to go out and report on elected officials and leaders and government without fear of repercussion. When we get into different systems of journalism later in the semester, we'll talk through different theories behind that, because not every press operates this way. There are some presses across the world that are subject to heavy censorship, and that can be very problematic, but not here in America. There's different types of papers, ranging from national, which of course are like your New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Large metropolitan dailies would be like the Boston Globe. A medium daily might be something like the Orlando Sentinel. A small daily would be like if you're in a local hometown, like a Statesboro paper. Then there's also minority papers, which are designed for a specific population. And then there are also college papers too. Our very own The Sentinel does a great job reporting what's happening on a really hyper-local level here at Kennesaw State. Papers tend to be pretty popular, like I was saying earlier. If we look here at this chart, this was from last year data talking about the top 25 newspapers just by digital traffic. We see usatoday.com actually had a little bit more traffic than NewYorkTimes.com. But these are all really heavily trafficked websites. Now, looking at this, you might be wondering, where's the Huffington Post? Isn't that a newspaper? No, actually. There's a different term for that. It's called a news aggregator. In fact, if you go to HuffingtonPost.com, you scroll all the way down to the very, very bottom, past all the hundreds of stories that are there on the front page, you'll see a list of all the other news sites that the Huffington Post is pulling stories from. That's known as a news aggregator. So what you're seeing on Huffington Post most of the time is not original reporting. Most of the time it's re-reporting of stories that come up in other important news websites, as well as important informed bloggers and other places on the web. So they're not actually a news organization. They really more of a news aggregator. They do it very well, and they're very popular for it. Looking at these charts, we see that the daily newspaper circulation totals don't really capture the full story, which means that we can't really measure the success or popularity of newspapers just by looking at circulation data like we could in the past. We see here in 2009, newspaper circulation took a nosedive. The economy was terrible that year too, so a lot of things took a nosedive that year. But look, it went right back up for 2012 and then dropped again in 2014. So we're seeing some different trends. We're seeing actually people are getting news either on their PCs, or they're using both mobile and PCs, or they're using mobile exclusive. That number is going to continue to rise, by the way, throughout the years. But we're seeing that people are still consuming news. We're just consuming it a little bit differently. Papers today, too, are different than papers of the past. Let's compare print and digital, for example. In print papers, really, if you think about it, there's a very limited amount of information that you can convey in a paper. There are very strict publication deadlines. The feedback mechanism is slower. If you wanted to give your print paper some feedback, you have to write to the editor in some way, or call the editor, or call the newspaper. It just takes a little bit longer. You only get pictures and words. That's it. You have a story and a picture or two to go with it, and that's it. And you have content written exclusively by trained journalists. Digital, however, wow, they're totally different. There's no limit to the amount of information that an online newspaper can convey, and this makes for some pretty powerful storytelling, especially if you get into the world of data journalism. There are no edition deadlines. The deadlines are as quickly as you can get information out there, sometimes even at the sake of accuracy. Digital newspapers are extremely interactive, especially if you look at some of the larger papers and to see what they're doing with data. And I'll include some links in this section to help illustrate my point there. They also can include video, and often include video, as well as user-generated content. Newspapers today online are not afraid to post a tweet here or there, or cite something from someone's Facebook feed, or even encourage audience members to contribute content. But at the end of the day, they do still have to make money. There's a huge economic component to newspapers. They still rely heavily on advertising rates. As you move forward into the discussions, I want you to think about if we still need papers, what the relevance of papers are today. I think they still hold a very important place in our media landscape, and hopefully you see it that way too after going through the lecture. I'm looking forward to hearing what you think either way.